welcome everyone. This is Dr. Mercola, and today we're here with Dr. Graveline, and we're going to talk about cholesterol and coenzyme Q10 and a lot of the implications of both of those. So I'm sure you'll be enlightened with the discussion. So welcome.
I'm glad to be here, Joe. Always
So,
glad to talk about statin drugs and cholesterol and CoQ10.
so you've had quite an experience with this, and I wonder if you can share with our listeners how you came to develop your expertise in this area.
This all started actually in 1999. At the time of my physical, I get annual physicals at Johnson Space Center in Houston because I'm a former astronaut. And in 1999, my cholesterol, which had been progressively rising a bit, was around 280, and they were pretty excited about it at that point, and I was mildly concerned about it. And when they suggested Lipitor 10, I went along with it because I had no reason to be particularly worried about statin drugs. I'd used it a few years, like a year or so before my retirement, but I wasn't a big user of it.
And these were the physicians with NASA?
Yes, the cardiologists with NASA and the flight surgeons.
Mm-hmm.
And anyway, I accepted this and was concerned slightly about my cholesterol, just as they were. As a family doctor, been a family doctor for 23 years. But I went home on 10 milligrams of Lipitor, and it was 6 weeks later when I experienced my first episode of what later was diagnosed as transient global amnesia. And this is an unusual form of amnesia wherein you immediately, without the slightest warning, you are unable to formulate new memory, and you can no longer communicate, not because you can't talk, but you can't remember the last syllable that was spoken to you. So nothing you say is relevant anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And in addition, you retrograde. You have a retrograde loss of memory for sometimes decades into the past. And in this particular episode, I seem to have jumped 10 years into the past because my wife, who saw me wandering about the yard with an unusual look on my face that morning, when she came out, I did not know who she was, and when she invited me into the house, to me it was it was not a familiar home. I'd never been there before, and I had never met that blonde woman before. She did offer me cookies and milk, and I took those outside on the steps, but I would not go in the house. And she was concerned about blood sugar for some reason. She plays nurse all the time. Anyway, she managed finally to get me into the car and off to the hospital, and the cookies did no good, incidentally. And I woke up, came to my senses at any rate, 6 hours later, in the office of a neurologist as he's pronouncing the diagnosis of transient global amnesia. Just about that time, I'm normal, and you become normal in a flash. Just as fast or rapid as you go into it, you come out of it.
This occurred in the late 90s?
No, 99. This is 99.
Okay.
Yeah. In March of 99. And I say March because I get my physical at NASA every March. Mm-hmm. And I stopped the drug on my own, even though he counseled me that statins was not of concern. When I asked him about this drug, I said, it's the only medicine I'm on. Don't you think you ought to give some consideration to this statin drug? He said, no, because statins don't do this. They've been using them for almost 10 years. Statins don't do this. So anyway, I did not believe him. After 23 years of family practice, I decided to treat myself. I stopped the medicine and went home and was absolutely normal following year. Now, I did have to go back to Johnson Space Center the following March, and sure enough, my cholesterol is exactly what it was before, around 280. And they really strongly suggested that I go back on Lipitor because statins don't do that. It was just a coincidence, according to every doctor there. So I did go back. I admit I was concerned, but yet I'd talked to maybe 30 doctors and a few pharmacologists during the interval, every chance I got really, and no one had given me any relief. They all said statins don't do that. So I allowed myself to go back on statins, but this time I said just 5 milligrams, and so I went home on 5, and 8 weeks later I had my worst episode, my second, my last, and my worst. And in this one, I was a 13-year-old high school student, and I was a high school student for 12 hours. And when they told me I was a doctor and married, I laughed hysterically, according to my wife, who was standing there next to me listening to all this. I didn't know who she was, of course. And I was a 13-year-old kid, and all of this was clearly impossible. I was 13. How could I be married? How could I be a doctor? I couldn't remember anything. I couldn't have doctored a mouse. And this is what convinced me when I finally woke up that something was wrong with the statin drugs. And yet the doctors there were, for years after that, still saying that this was just a remarkable coincidence. But this took me out of retirement, and I've been actively involved in researching statin drugs since that time.
Very interesting. So you had a personal encounter, an adverse effect from the use of the statins, and for the last 10 years you've been researching that more carefully, and I'm wondering what you learned in your journey.
Step by step, I've been learning as I went along. I realized that I did need a book if I was going to be effective in giving this information back to the lay public and to the doctors. So my first book was titled Lipitor, Thief of Memory. But it only took a few more months before I realized that this wasn't just Lipitor, and it wasn't just memory. And it was soon evident to me that all of the statin drugs were involved, and all of the full range of cognition was not only subject to adverse reactions, but there were many other effects: personality change, and an unusual form of chronic muscle, and a chronic peripheral neuropathy, and even an ALS type of thing was soon evident, and people were reporting to me. And my website very abruptly became a repository for statin users worldwide because of the media expression, the media support I had from Joe Graydon of People's Pharmacy. And Joe Graydon, in my ultimate trying to reach an explanation, I had called Joe Graydon and asked him if he had ever heard of any unusual reactions associated with statins. And Joe had directed me to the statin study under Beatrice Golem in San Diego, California, and then he also asked me if I minded if he put my story on his column that goes out, a syndicated newspaper column. And I said, of course not. The more exposure, the better. And once that went out, over the next several months, tons of emails came in from people just previously having no idea that all of these things that were happening to them could have been a statin related. And we got 22 more cases of transient global amnesia just in a matter of a few weeks, and we got hundreds and hundreds of cases of cognitive damage. But anyway, my website grew to be a major repository, and ultimately I've got well over 10,000 people who have reported to me from everywhere.
Has this amnesia been documented in the scientific literature now as an adverse side effect from the
Yes, it is now, and it is now throughout the medical literature and scientific literature. All of these side effect things that I warned about 10 years ago are now completely endorsed by research. And I've never come up with any blind alleys. At first, I was very suspicious as CoQ10 way back when. But then, as I went on and realized that some of these chronic muscle cases and chronic nerve cases, if we postulated a CoQ10 deficiency, what was our explanation for the fact that many of these people did not improve? Better than half of them stayed just the same regardless of how much CoQ10 you gave or whatever form you gave it in. And
Interesting.
with that, it made me look for some other cause. And this is where I realized that it was the mitochondrial damage and mutations that were the real endpoint of statin damage, secondary to CoQ10. But once formed, all the CoQ10 in the
Well,
world wouldn't change things.
well, let's step back a bit because the most common side effect from the statins doesn't appear to be the amnesia. I mean, it's well documented prior to this that the breakdown in the muscles is a really clear and potentially dangerous side effect from taking the statins. And you didn't have, I think it's called rhabdomyolysis. And maybe you can review the typical side effects that people can receive, that clearly were not disputed, and that were most likely also related to coenzyme Q10. So if you can discuss that, it would be great.
There are three major classes of side effects from the statin drugs, and you're absolutely right that cognition, confusion, disorientation, forgetfulness, dementia are not this same mechanism. At least I don't think they have the same mechanism. The cognitive appear to be a cholesterol deficiency. You're just being given a statin, and my cholesterol plummeted from 280 down to 150, 155. I was overjoyed to get that first one back, and then it was only the next day that I had my condition of transient global amnesia. So this is due to cholesterol insufficiency. You're going along at whatever your normal is. Suddenly, after you take a statin, your cholesterol has dropped down 40, 50 milligrams. This is abnormal for your body, and this mechanism was sort of going around in my head, and then they came out in research, actually, in the year 2001, that how valuable cholesterol was in memory formation. This is something we didn't know during the initial phase of statin marketing. We didn't have the slightest idea what this would do to cholesterol in the brain because we didn't understand the cholesterol value to the brain. So all of the cognitive problems are secondary. I say most all the cognitive problems are secondary to this lowering of cholesterol below normal for your body.
Mm-hmm.
Then we have another whole group that has to do with dolichols. Now, you recall when a statin is used, statins block the mevalonate pathway to get at cholesterol inhibition, and it works very beautifully.
Mm-hmm.
But in so doing, it's inevitable that they will block CoQ10 and dolichols, as well as other major biochemicals, but these are the two I want to focus on. And the dolichol is one that most doctors had never even heard of before, but it just so happens that dolichols are almost as important as CoQ10 and cholesterol. Now, dolichols are absolutely vital to the process of glycoprotein synthesis. Now, you and I are doctors. We'd never even heard of this in medical school.
No.
At least I didn't. And so I start poking around in the biochemistry books, and I realize what is going on. And when you start reading on glycoprotein synthesis, you read how valuable dolichols are, and you see it has to do with cell identification, it has to do with cell communication, has to do with immunodefense, and has to do with the process of neurohormone formation.